This has to be one of the most beautiful stretches of the River Thames. Perfect place for a country cottage. The second Duke of Buckingham thought so too, when back in 1666, the year of the Great Fire of London, he bought 160 acres of scrubland up there on the cliff and started the mammoth task of levelling the site to build himself a country retreat where he could escape from London and entertain his mistress, Anna, the Countess of Shrewsbury. Quite reasonably, her husband, the Earl of Shrewsbury, was not too pleased with this arrangement, so he challenged Buckingham to a duel. Not one of his best ideas, as it turns out, as it was he, Shrewsbury, who was wounded and was to eventually die from his injuries. Shrewsbury's wife moved in with the Duke of Buckingham at Cliveden. When his own wife, Mary, said that she was not too happy about being part of a threesome, the Duke said that he quite understood and had already arranged for her carriage to come and take her back to her father. Levelling the site without the help of modern machinery was a major undertaking and never completely finished, and so, even today, the front of the house is some 25 feet higher than the back. This resulted in the building of one of Cliveden's most distinctive features, the arcaded terrace, which still stands today, although the house itself has been rebuilt twice. In contrast to his colourful life, the Duke of Buckingham's death was a sombre affair. He died in 1687 in obscurity, lonely and without an heir. 9 years later, the Earl of Orkney, who was a general in the Duke of Marlborough's army, bought Cliveden. The Earl never seemed to have a bank balance to match some of his more grandiose plans for Cliveden. It was typical of him to have elaborate plans drawn up for the parterre based on the ornamental gardens at Versailles, and then opt for a really basic design of 2 rows of trees on each side of a central lawn. He didn't stint on spending money on the house, however, and got his architect, Thomas Archer, to remove the hipped roof and the top attics so that it now looked more balanced. He then extended the house by adding colonnades and wings to the front. Lord Orkney had the fashionable Venetian architect Giacomo Leoni build the Blenheim Pavilion to celebrate his success at the Battle of Blenheim. Leoni also designed and built the Octagon Temple on the west side of the parterre, not as a family mausoleum as it is today, but as a 2-storey tea room with magnificent views down the Thames. The Earl lived here for some 40 years and spent much time and effort on the gardens. The style of the estate as it is today is mainly the result of his vision. After his death in 1733, his daughter, Anne, leased Cliveden to the heir to the throne, Frederick the Prince of Wales, for £600 a year. In spite of having an allowance of £50,000 a year, he was always in debt. His relationship with his parents, George II and Queen Caroline, was not good and went from bad to worse. Anyone who was anti-establishment was his friend. He delighted in the friendship and company of writers and painters. He organised musical and theatrical get-togethers. Rule Britannia had its first public performance here in the amphitheatre at one of his musical soirees. Frederick was a great family man and enjoyed making Cliveden into a home for his many children. It was ironic then that it was an injury during a game of cricket with his children that killed him before he could become king. Cliveden reverted back to Anne, the Countess of Orkney, and her husband, Lord Inchkin. They never actually moved in because they were happily settled next door at Taplow Court, so Cliveden remained empty until their granddaughter, Mary, moved in. While she was living here, a careless servant turning down one of the beds knocked over a candle and set fire to the house. The central block and most of its contents were completely destroyed, leaving only the wings and colonnades standing. Mary continued to live in one of the surviving wings until her death. The site remained in this derelict state for some 30 years until it was eventually put up for auction in 1821. It was bought by the bon vivant Sir George Warrender, who had William Byrne build him a 2-storey mansion on the foundations of the original building and incorporate the existing colonnades into the new design. Sir George began to entertain lavishly, and Cliveden soon regained its former reputation as a place of generous hospitality. He enjoyed this good life right up until his death in 1849. The second Duke of Sutherland bought Cliveden for his wife Harriet for £30,000. Harriet was best friend and mistress of the robes to Queen Victoria. No sooner had she moved into Cliveden than she was ripping the interior apart. A few months into the house's makeover, and just over 50 years after the previous fire, the house caught fire again. Queen Victoria, down the road at Windsor, saw the flames and sent her fire engines to help fight the blaze. The main building was almost completely destroyed, and to stop the fire spreading, the rescuers ripped out the colonnades, so this time only the wings survived. Examination of the debris showed that a timber joist was protruding into one of the chimneys and had caught fire. Harriet was extremely fortunate because although she hadn't got round to paying even one insurance premium, the underwriters decided to cover the loss. The Sutherlands got Charles Barry, who was in the middle of building the Houses of Parliament, to build them their new mansion, which is the house that exists today. John Fleming, their head gardener, redesigned the parterre into the geometric design that it is today. But unlike today, where the beds are full of Senecio, Sant'Elena and Nepeta, he filled the beds with brilliantly coloured flowers, replanting them twice a year and pioneering a style that municipal parks and gardens have used ever since. A large water tank, disguised as a clock tower, was built to store 17,000 gallons of water pumped from White Place Farm on the other side of the Thames. A statue of the Duke was placed at the end of the Grand Avenue, where the Shell Fountain is today. After the Duke died, the Duchess continued to entertain famous people of the time, such as Tennyson, Gladstone, Garibaldi. Even Queen Victoria, who would often escape from Windsor, pop down the river and have tea with Harriet in Spring Cottage. The Duchess died in 1868, and Cliveden was bought by the immensely rich Duke of Westminster. To satisfy his passion for racing, he created the stable block and a stud farm. He resited the main entrance to where it is today and decided to remodel the two wings of the house in a Flemish Renaissance style to be built in pink stucco. Only one wing was ever completed, and that was demolished as one of the first acts of the next owner, William Waldorf Astor, who bought Cliveden in 1893. William Waldorf Astor, reputed to be the richest man in America, disenchanted with the States, moved his home and family to Europe. He had a love of Italian style, which stemmed from his years as American minister in Rome. It was during this period that he started collecting many of the objects that can be seen around the estate. Unfortunately, his wife, Mary, died within the year and so was never able to enjoy the improvements that William Waldorf brought to the property. He replaced the Duke of Sutherland's statue in the Grand Avenue with the elaborate shell fountain designed for him by Thomas Waldo Storey. The female figures are supposed to have discovered the fountains of love and are experiencing the effects of its wonderful elixir. The Duke's statue was moved to an area now known as the Duke's Seat, which is probably the best vantage point on the estate. He laid out the long garden with statues and topiary. His shyness, deepened by the loss of his wife, made him withdraw into his own private world. He finished off the perimeter wall and retreated behind the elaborate new entrance gates, earning himself the local nickname of Waldorf by name, walled off by nature. He remodelled the interior of the Octagon Temple and covered the walls and ceilings with mosaics depicting religious scenes, and turned Lord Orkney's tea room into the final resting place for the Astor family. He brought the Borghese balustrade from Rome, installing it on the parterre. The eagles are the emblems of the Borghese family. William Waldorf must have liked the design of the balustrade because he had copies of it made and put them around the tortoise fountain and the landing stage of Spring Cottage. A pagoda, originally built as a temporary exhibit at the Paris exhibition of 1867, was placed on an island in one of the estate duck ponds and forms the basis of today's water garden. When his son, Waldorf, married the Southern belle Nancy Langan in 1906, he gave them Cliveden as a wedding present and retired to Hever Castle in Kent. Nancy Astor soon brought the woman's touch to Cliveden. Out went the antiquities and what she called the splendid gloom, and in came the chintz, flowers and electric lighting. Cliveden was transformed from the very private retreat of the shy William Waldorf Astor into a centre of political and literary society. House parties, with the help of their legendary butler, Mr. Lee, were attracting the famous and the influential. Nancy Astor soon became a much admired hostess. Parties were often enlivened by her unpredictable behaviour. Guests could unwittingly find themselves the butt of her rapier tongue. Waldorf was the popular MP for Plymouth and was responsible for setting up the first Ministry of Health. When, on his father's death in 1919, he became Viscount Astor, he was forced to give up being an MP for Plymouth and reluctantly moved to the House of Lords. Nancy, egged on by those around her, stood as the new Tory candidate for her husband's old constituency.
She didn't think she'd go into Parliament. And it was only Mr. Lee said to me, he said, I suggested it to her. He said, before anybody else. He said, how about you go into Parliament? No, she said, it's not, it's a man's job. No, it's not, he said to her. He said, I understand there's a new law by which women can go into Parliament. She said, how about you having a go? She said, you've got plenty of old chat. And he said, there's a need for women to discuss women's problems and children's problems. And then Lady Astor then waited until Lord Astor came downstairs. She said to Lord Astor, she said, Lee suggested I should go into Parliament. Lord Astor said, that's a good idea, Nancy. By means that we will not lose the seat. And she said, well, I said, would they have me as a woman? So well, I don't know, but he said, we'll find out.
They agreed.
I hate all kinds of wars. That's absolutely true. But particularly I hate civil war, class war, or sex war. They're almost worse to me than an international war, but I hate wars. But I like fighting. but I like fighting for justice.
After a lively campaign, Nancy Astor was elected as MP for the Sutton constituency of Plymouth with an increased majority. She became the first woman to take her seat in the House of Commons. Soon others would follow her. But being a woman in what had always been an exclusive gentlemen's club had its problems. Not everyone approved.
It was a good time then, and I remember Winston Churchill. He said to me once, "It's a very remarkable performance. We hope to freeze you out." When you entered the House of Commons, I felt like a woman had entered my bathroom and I'd nothing to protect myself with except a sponge.
Nancy involved herself with women and children's issues in Plymouth, and so found herself a regular commuter on the train between Cliveden and her constituency.
Sometimes she went to Plymouth, and she always made sure she shook hands with the driver. So the driver always had to wash his hands, make sure he's going to shake hands, and had a few words with her. She was very nicely thoughtful like that. She used to go to her area with £50 and give it all away to good causes. She also came with blankets. When she knew her child was born, she'd come with give them a new blanket, give them £2 or £3, you see. And even if they were a labourer, she'd say, well, you must have it because you were another child, you see. I think the Plymouth people thought she was a cat's whiskers, and I have a high regard for her.
In 1923, Nancy introduced a private members' bill limiting the sale of alcohol to young people. Although the Astors served their guest drinks with their meals and had a fine wine cellar, being Christian Scientists, they didn't actually drink themselves.
They would never drink alcoholic drinks, the Astors. The children could, but not Lady Astor or Lord Astor. They drink soft drinks. But there's drink for everyone else, you see, if they wanted. But they're not encouraged to become worse for drink, you see. And if they did, they'd never be invited again. I've never seen anybody in Astor's worse for drink.
Although she was a teetotaler, Nancy Astor, the butler used to give her Dubonnet and lemonade, and she'd say, "That's not an alcohol drink, is it, Lee?" And he'd say, "Oh, no, my lady," which was lovely. You know, we used to laugh about it. On May the 19th, which was her birthday and Lord Astor's birthday, they decided that for the staff they would give a big party, and the caterers used to come early and get it all ready, and it used to be really and truly a meal that staff in those days wouldn't have dreamed of because it was so good. I even think we could have caviar for a starter if we wanted it, you know, all that sort of thing. It was really a big treat.
Between the wars, house parties flourished. Cliveden, helped by its idyllic setting by the river and now legendary hospitality, was at the top of everybody's list of places to be invited to. Ascot was undoubtedly the highlight of the Cliveden social year.
We used to all look forward to it because it was really something to see all the guests in their finery, going to races, coming back for dances and all that. And the arrangement was from the beginning of the year to June to get us ready for Ascot. Gold Cup Day was a very special day, and there used to be a very special dinner. That was really something, because they used to have some beautiful furniture in the large drawing room, and everything was moved. And that's where the band and the dance was. And all the doors and that windows slung open, and the staff, unbeknown to the gentry, used to get around Tom Folly. You know the bit that's called Tom Folly, round the front. We used to go round there where we couldn't be seen and listen to the music.
Cliveden, with its closeness to London, was the place for political house parties. It was where it all happened, where friendships were nurtured and deals were struck. It was said that decisions made here one day could affect the whole of the British Empire the next. Waldorf and Nancy were compulsive entertainers. A group of regular house guests became known as the Cliveden set and were said to be sympathetic to Adolf Hitler. Well, maybe some of them were, but as the Cliveden set represented all shades of the political spectrum, there were probably just as many who weren't. At one of Nancy's parties in 1936, she told Hitler's ambassador that nobody will ever take the Führer seriously until he shaves off his silly Charlie Chaplin moustache. Cliveden's visitors' book read like who's who. They came from all walks of life. Amy Johnson, Charles Chaplin, George Bernard Shaw, President Roosevelt, Harold Macmillan, Henry Ford, and various members of royalty. The names are endless. And it wasn't just the house guests that got to enjoy the Astor hospitality. In gratitude for their hard work, the staff were provided with excellent sports and social facilities. Staff parties were a regular part of life at Cliveden.
Nancy in Waldorf Astor would always pass the time of day with you and ask you how you were getting on, if everything was all right, that sort of thing. They never sort of ignored you, ever. The day after Christmas, Boxing Day, we used to be invited up there because they had a lovely Christmas tree in the main entrance hall, and we were always invited to go in, and we used to be given mince pies and sherry or hot toddy or something like that. And they used to just come round and have a good old chat with us about the year and thank us for the hard work we'd done, and so that was very nice.
Before the First World War, the Astors had donated the area around their huge covered tennis court to the Canadian Red Cross to build a hospital. They now gave more land to enlarge the hospital from 100 to 600 beds. Nancy would breeze through the wards giving support and encouragement, especially to those who were critically ill.
She'd come and try to persuade him not to turn to the wall and to die. And she'd say, please don't die, please don't die. If you live, I'll give you a gold watch and chain. And she'd flash the gold watch and chain. And some survived and some didn't. But if they survived, she'd give them a gold watch and chain.
The hospital had an enviable success rate, probably to the delight of the local jewellers. The hospital effectively treated thousands of patients during both World Wars. Those that did die were buried here at Cliveden. Waldorf converted his father's Italian garden into a war memorial garden. The statue that watches over it represents the spirit of Canada. The face of the statue is said to be that of Nancy. In 1942, Waldorf decided to give his beloved Cliveden and many of its historic collections to the National Trust.
One day when I was talking to Lord Astor, and he got talking about Cliveden, and that he said to me, I feel that it's so unfair for one person to own so much without sharing it. So he said that's why it's into the National Trust hands. And I thought that was wonderful, you know, to think that he thought like that, because some people, if they've got a big house, they don't want to share it, do they?
Waldorf made provision for the Astors to be able to live here as long as they wished, and that it should always be used for the furtherance of cooperation between the peoples of Britain and North America. Nancy and Waldorf spent much of the war at their house in Plymouth, sharing the pain and grief of their constituents. When the war ended, they shared with them their joy and relief. With the war behind them, the political mood in the country was changing rapidly. Many in the Conservative Party believed that Nancy, who had survived 6 general elections, was becoming a liability. Waldorf realised this and was concerned how she would cope with rejection.
I don't want to emphasise it too much, but you see, he wanted her to leave Parliament, and she didn't. But if she had, she may have lost her seat. And it broken-hearted then. No, I think that they had a row, and Lord Astor stood his ground.
Nancy felt betrayed and reluctantly retired from politics. But the episode put too great a strain on their marriage, and they spent most of the next 6 or 7 years living separate lives. It wasn't until Waldorf had a heart attack that Nancy returned to Cliveden and nursed him to the end. After Waldorf's death, Cliveden lost its appeal, and Nancy moved down to her house in Kent, grieving bitterly for the years they'd wasted, leaving Cliveden in the custody of their eldest son, Bill Astor.
Under his lordship there was 4 gardeners and a tractor driver. And one day we said to Charlie, put the brake on the tractor. And he'd never put his brake on the tractor. And we should say, Charlie, put that brake on the tractor. And this day, Charlie didn't put the brake on the tractor, and it started crawling and crawling. Over the bank it went, straight down into the river. Yeah, it was the funniest thing we ever did see. New tractor. Yeah, Ferguson it was. Yeah, new Ferguson.
Bill Astor, with the help of John, Charlie and the others, replanted extensive areas of the beechwoods. They constructed a rose garden where the secret garden is today, as a private retreat for the family to escape to on the days when the National Trust opened part of the house to the public.
Well, occasionally when we were out there, we used to see his lordship painting with his brush and all his things, but we kept away from him because there was his private, you know, he was private then.
His mother, Nancy, had always loved swimming in the Thames. Although a keen swimmer, she hated swimming pools, saying they're disgusting, never trust people in pools. Bill, however, liked pools and had one built in the walled garden alongside the house. He could surely never have imagined that this pool could topple a government and bring such notoriety to Cliveden.
Stephen Ward rented Spring Cottage from Lord Astor for £1 a year, on the understanding that if anybody had any back problems or anything that needed an osteopath, he would treat them free.
When I was fishing with Stephen Ward, he used to say, anybody up there with back trouble, he said, just turn the name to me. He said, and I'll do it free, he said. Yes.
Dr. Ward used to come to Cliveden virtually every weekend during the summer with his lovely ladies in tow. And they used to spend a lot of time in the swimming pool in the evenings. Well, I lived near the swimming pool, but obviously it's surrounded by a high wall. But then I discovered if I stood on my draining board, I could see what was going on in the swimming pool. Well, I spent many happy hours on my draining board, watching Stephen and his lady friends drinking champagne and having a good time in the pool. It used to be quite amusing that the gardeners used to fight and quarrel over who was going to do the watering on the Sunday.
We gardeners used to fight to get to Spring Cottage, yeah. We used to see all the girls laid out on the lawn and everything, everything there, yeah. It was really, it made their day. It made their day.
One Friday in 1961, Ward and 3 of his house guests were fooling around at the Cliveden pool when Lord Astor and one of his guests, John Profumo, turned up. They'd been out for an after-dinner stroll and were attracted by the sound of hilarity. At this time, Profumo was Secretary of State for War in the Macmillan government and tipped as next Tory leader. One of Ward's guests was his protégée, Christine Keeler. Profumo was clearly attracted to Keeler. On the Sunday, Ward invited Eugene Ivanov to join him at Cliveden. Now, Ivanov, as well as being a Russian naval attaché, was a spy.
Stephen Ward and Ivanov used to jump into their car, shove as many of these lovely ladies into it as they could, and off to the Feathers for their Sunday drink and maybe lunch.
Ward encouraged an affair to blossom between Profumo and Keeler. It seems probable that Profumo was unaware that Christine Keeler was also having a relationship with Ivanov. This was the early 60s, not only the time of the Beatles and swinging London, but also a time of high political tension. The Cold War was at its height. So when the Profumo scandal, as it became known, broke in the press, the repercussions were devastating. Profumo first denied his affair with Keeler in the House of Commons and then was forced to admit that he had lied to Parliament and so had to resign. Stephen Ward was arrested for pimping but died of an overdose of Nembutal whilst the jury was still considering its verdict.
At Chilham Castle, most people thought Mr. Macmillan looked better. That Profumo business surely had blown over.
But it wasn't to be. Macmillan's health deteriorated and he too resigned. Conspiracy theories abounded. Who was the manipulator? Who was the manipulated? Even today, some 40 years later, we don't know for sure who was working for which intelligence agency. Everyone went to great lengths to try and keep the news of the scandal from Nancy, but she inevitably found out about it. In 1964, Nancy, for many years probably the world's most famous woman, died, and with her, an era. 2 years later, Bill died from a heart attack. And Cliveden was finally handed over to her present guardians, the National Trust, and a new chapter in the house's life began. For the next 14 years, Stanford University of California leased Cliveden as one of their overseas study centres.
It seems mean, but it was the biggest shock of my life. The coach arrived at the front door and all these people, very improperly dressed, got out and come in the front of the house. And they left all their empty bottles and cans on the doorstep.
And they didn't understand what Cliveden, I mean, to us, Cliveden was a stately home. It didn't mean that to them, I don't think, because I don't think they realised that they were living, you know, in such grandeur, so they just treated it like students do their sort of accommodation, unfortunately.
They had clothes and beds there and hanging out of the front windows, and I used to have to go outside and look up and think, oh dear, the room it's got the bed hanging outside. I used to chase around the house before it opened to the public saying, you must take it in, we open to the public at 2 o'clock.
Filling Cliveden with 80 boisterous students and utilitarian furniture was not doing it justice. So, after Stanford moved out, the National Trust hit upon a better solution for Cliveden's renaissance. They granted a lease for the mansion to be turned into a hotel. It's been incredibly successful and is now considered to be one of the finest hotels in Europe. heyday, Cliveden had 100 staff, over 50 of them just looking after the grounds. Today, the National Trust has just 13 permanent staff looking after its 376 acres. That means each gardener is responsible for an area the size of 11 football pitches. An impossible task? Well, it would be if it wasn't for the team of generous volunteers who give up so much of their time to help. It's through their combined efforts that the grounds are gradually being returned to a state that its previous owners would have been proud of. But Cliveden won't survive by living in the past, so the estate has to be constantly improved to preserve it for future generations. As well as the gardens around the house, there are miles of footpaths to explore. "180,000 people come to Cliveden each year, and yet somehow it always seems possible to find yourself a quiet spot if you want to be alone." If you've already visited Cliveden, you'll probably understand its magic and why Nancy Astor referred to it as Camelot on Thames. But do be warned, Cliveden may bewitch you, and like so many other people, you may find yourself coming back time after time after time.